Okay, so we have plenty of time for discussion. We have 20 minutes. So I want to thank our speakers, first of all, for such interesting and rich talks that went together in very intriguing ways.
We did not plan this, and there was this discussion about, like, should we coordinate? And then it turns out we made perfectly symmetrical talks in a really striking way.
So I'm going to take the liberty of asking a first question while all of you are mulling over the questions you want to ask. So I want to ask a question about, so you were, in a way, both talking about the way in which, the way that technology addresses us, right? And I'm interested in the way you both addressed us through technology, in a sense, and what that had to do with your arguments about technology and communication. So it's interesting, when you started, for example, Mercedes, you said, oh, I'm going to talk about everything that Finn talked about, but he did it in a kind of dark mode, and I'm going to do it in a light and cute mode. And then, of course, your examples of technology were ones, right, in which they were cute animals, or et cetera, whereas, of course, your examples of technology were much more, oh, technology as the alien. And then I think also that the way in which you both sort of engaged or imitated, in a sense, technology in your own address. So you sort of literally imitated the voice of the Roomba in talking to us, which is exactly one of those sort of cute technologies that's designed to sort of be like a little pet in your house, sort of. And Finn, I thought it was interesting that, you were talking about that people at first using phones would talk to the phone as if it was this alien being, and we needed to learn to kind of deal with it in a different way. But of course, you were sort of talking through your phone, in a sense, even as you were giving it. And then there was also one moment the one and only moment when you said exactly, replicated what was on the screen, right? So kind of your own voice and then the screen communication through technology, and you said, oh, this is the only time I'm going to do that. I'm not going to sort of imitate what is also coming through the technology. So there seem to be, again, these sort of different affective or rhetorical relations to technology in your own address about the way we communicate with and through technology. So I'm just interested if either of you want to reflect on sort of your own deployment or dialogue with technology or displacement of technology, or in your own sort of rhetorical and I think affective stances about it.
No, you start. I need to come down from talk.
Well, so one of the first things that I ever wrote in an academic capacity was when I was working relatively early in the SPAM project, and it was an attempt to write a philosophical dialogue that I had with a modified, like, porn chatbot that had been sort of shifted to be more like a sort of, Alcibiades kind of figure that I could have a conversation with, precisely to see what would happen to the conversation, to try to sort of have this, like, interlocutory experience. So for me, one of the challenges precisely with working on a topic like this, and in particular with presenting on a topic like this, is to try to find ways to keep some of the alienness of which I'm not saying is necessarily something I succeeded in doing here, but it's what your question sort of provokes in me to think about, to precisely, I want to find ways to keep us from getting too comfortable with human discourse, so that we don't necessarily lose sight of the other kinds of less human discourses that are at play in one way or another. And so in this case, I wasn't able to do as much of it with the presentation as I would have liked, but absolutely to find a way to be able to bring more of those, in the same way that we have the bird song outside and the weather outside and the sort of unfolding of these things in the background, sometimes very notably, as with Lisa's talk at the end of the day, where as the affective horror of the situation being described escalated, the weather got harder and harder outside. It rained more and more intensely until it was almost drowning out some of the statement. In the same way, I would love to find a way to keep the ongoing presence of the alienness, which we usually only see at the beginnings of talks in media studies events when we can't get the projector to work and we have to, like, briefly look at the device itself. I would love to find ways to sort of bring that and its constant intimacy in the discourse more to the forefront. And I'm happy that some of that kind of came through in a strange way. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I can look at this. I think the interesting thing what I found was that Finn in his talk looked at literally, I mean, we both did very much the gender thing. He looked inside and very technical things, and I looked at the cute outside surface. But the thing is that you showed that inside it's quite messy and it's quite living in a certain way, and it has problems, it's not clean. While I showed that the outside, soft-looking, nice things actually have sort of a black box, which you wouldn't think that you know, you normally think the black box is if you lift up the hood like Finn did. And I tried to show that the black box is actually not just under the hood, but also in front of it. And I think why we both resonate then at the same time very well is because we both deal in a bit different ways with this alienist computer or technology has for us. And that goes also back for me to something that was said yesterday about Leroi-Gourhan. Because he wrote about technology, that technology, you know, he addressed it as evolution. It is not, it's sort of a living thing. And of course, the interesting thing is, so how is it related? I mean, the interesting thing is that we cannot say what's the next big thing. You know, technology cannot be foreseen. So.
Yeah. So, question, yeah, Bonnie.
Okay, so thank you very much for two really interesting papers. I just wanted to ask both of you to think a little bit more about play. In the first paper, it seemed like which I loved, but towards the end, it seemed like you were staying still in the frame of communication in some strange way. You ended on a note of what sounded to me like ideology critique. You know, we're building these alien systems and we need to understand them. The language, the verbs were very communicative, very much in the domain of communicative action, in fact. And so I wondered, what if we, you know, joined you in your project, but privileged instead forms of play, like hacktivism, other kinds of participatory modes of belonging to technology as opposed to knowing, understanding, exposing, and how those different vernaculars might offer different orientations. And then relatedly, I don't think that all play is infantilizing. I think playfulness can be infantilizing, but it isn't necessarily, and there is such a thing as kind of serious play in the sense of being able to do serious things with play, and playfulness being a serious intervention sometimes in things that want to be taken seriously but shouldn't be, or not at least on their own terms. And so, so I was just thinking that play could offer a way that is neither nor empowerment nor what was your other one? I don't remember. Infantilization or patronization, and that would mean that those kinds of playful images can be seen in a more interestingly double sense of trying to co-opt us into mere playfulness, but also inciting us into the other kinds of playfulness at the same time. So appealing to the infant in you when you're not allowed to actually experience developmentally infancy, because we all have to be adults and workers and productive so fast, is actually potentially quite different from how you were describing it, potentially more empowering in a completely different sort of a way.
I meant it quite empowering. So I meant being infantile, not, I don't think it's a negative word, you know.
Oh, it sounded really negative, so
Yeah.
it wasn't negative?
The playfulness, I mean, this is exactly why I showed the games of the Dieter Rams design, because these are games that are playful as well, but they address the child very differently. And I don't, that my point I was trying to make was the first part of my talk, you're completely right. I went very long down the road and said, this is manipulation. But the important thing that I wanted to point out is what we need to turn around, because it's not just manipulation, it also can be quite empowering. And I had a long discussion with Robert Oxon and the designer about this, that I completely agree. Playfulness is really, really happy. That's also why I think logic's not a derivative of language.
Okay.
It is really, really important. Yeah, thanks for pointing
Okay.
that out.
I can actually build very briefly on exactly that for my answer as well, which would be that you're absolutely right about, and it's something where this is stuff that I'm just starting to try to think about now. So a lot of this is kind of rough-edged, and bits and pieces aren't necessarily included. But there's definitely a thread of playfulness in this. One of the things that astonishes me. So the designer Sarah Dean and I are actually working on building a comprehensive vocabulary of every attempt to communicate with extraterrestrial life, and all the different like media and structures and systems and theories that underlie that. We just got a website. It's feti.space, F-E-T-I, for formats for extraterrestrial life. There's literally just HTML that's like, there will be something here eventually. But one thing that is very quickly becomes clear going through them systematically is that we never just want to establish contact so we can like exchange the existence of natural numbers with some other form of life. Way too fast, if you look at it from any reasonable perspective, way too quickly, people want to rush to like playing games. So like Lancelot Hogben, the last section of his proposal for Astroglossa is a kind of cosmic chess that we could start playing with these other forms of life. Or Freudenthal, of course, runs immediately into like these elaborate playlets that we have where we like establish these complicated, like sort of imaginary relationships. The reason I say this is that I think that is wonderful, and I think you're absolutely right that that is a very different mode for that kind of engagement. The reason for wanting to take this extraterrestrial thread is precisely to not lose sight of the alienness, to not lose it too quickly, in a very similar way to the idea that I think in many ways so much of our relationship to the world, from Le Wagourhan and from these sort of logical theories, I think we can unassailably say is bodily, is kinesthetic, is structured around the experience of having bodies. And we are interacting with things that do not have bodies and engage with the nature of their existence in ways that are so profoundly different. I don't want us to lose those in the urge to get into a playful space, but I definitely take your point that that should be the next step.
All right, so we had a question in the back, and then a question over here, and then a question from Wendy, and hopefully also a question from Gertrude. Hopefully we'll have time for all. Well, let's see where we get in time, but
All right.
yes.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks a lot to the two of you. That was great. I enjoyed it. I have two questions based on Mercedes' talk, but I think they kind of affect both of your talks. The first one is Althusser's interpellation. I was wondering, there is kind of Rancière's inversion of that, which says that it's not about hey you anymore, but the way the police works is move along, there is nothing to see. So to not interfere with the smooth circulation, of capital words and things. And given that Finn's talk that much of communication is between machines and seeing the cuteness of the Google signs, I wonder, the question would be whether this is not more about the dissimulation of address and the lack of meaningful address these days. And the second question is related to that. Again, the cuteness, right, of the images. I was thinking of Sian and Guy's book on cute, zany, interesting as 3 aesthetic categories of the present, and the whole cuteness as a way of, in a sense, breeding the docile consumer on an effective level. So my question would be, how does your take on communication relate to affect then in these kinds of mechanisms? So these two questions.
Do we collect, or shall I answer directly?
I would say still answer directly now,
Right.
because maybe we won't need to collect. We'll see.
Yeah, very good example. I think move along, there is nothing to see, is what is also happening there. Of course, yeah, if it's cute, it doesn't say, hey, you like a policeman does. So, yeah, good. I'll pick that up in my next talk. Yeah, I think the effective, and especially, you can see that technology, we tend to think technology looks like you showed it. That's what these alien sort of weird things we don't understand. And therefore it tries to be super cute and super effective because that's what it doesn't have, emotions. Of course there's a sort of relation there. And that's something that should be explored in greater depth, I agree.
Where's it, over here? You've got the mic still, so yes.
So I suppose, yeah, to continue maybe some of the questions about serious play, for example, the child as a category seems worthy of further interrogation in both contexts that because it would seem to me, first of all, that that's the first being that's being infantilized as a child. And the assumption that there are adults patronizing children, you know, itself ought to put it maybe more concretely, like Mercedes, the examples you showed, that those little logos or even the Fisher-Price Game Center has been designed by an adult is epistemologically suspect, let's say. And you know, that could lead, I mean, or that somebody like Licklider is an adult, you know, epistemologically speaking, politically speaking, let's say, and so on, critical, right, possessing reason in the classical sense. So you know, I was wondering what you thought, for example, what concretely, pedagogically, for example, might be the consequences of the sort of efforts both of you have made to you know, walk that line. But then historically, how we might think, like, for example, the problem of addressing aliens as if they were children or as if they were our parents. You know, how to sort, in a sense, the narratives around the history of technology differently than those that are, in effect, being scripted by exactly this kind of childish imagery, which starts, of course, in the conference rooms in which, you know, with the popcorn and the Coke and all the rest of it, the hardware and software is being designed, written, and so on and so forth. So it would seem to me that there's a deeper line that's running through this question.
I can say just a quick sentence, actually, to set up. I would just want to mention that one of the really striking things about trying to think extraterrestrially about sort of interacting with computing, but one that also runs back through Licklider's work and through people like it, Latour talks about the idea that it's very important to understand the adverbial nature of certain kinds of relationships between things, that things will relate to each other legally or economically or other sort of ending in ly kinds of things. And it's fascinating to see, especially the early genesis of computing is very often built on family models, on the idea that exactly the computer addresses you like childishly or paternalistically or in some way kind of out of a mode of human relationship. And it's interesting to see that we cannot seem to purge that from ourselves, even when we are trying to interact with beings that we may know literally nothing about. So it's a great challenge to say exactly, like getting beyond that. But I leave that to you.
Basically, to de-Oedipalize the relationship.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I think you're right. I think, you know, if there would be enough time, one would also need to go down and reflect on how the character of the child is different in each time, because of course it's historical and it changes a lot. And this sort of surfaces that I showed is a very specific, very contemporary child. It's not the child of the 70s, as you could see when you saw the Lion Turtle and the children playing around. And being a child in the 70s and being a child now is very different. And this plays in there. And I found it very interesting because actually the move so clearly, I think I haven't seen it for a long time. It took me very long to come up with the idea of infantilization. And who annoyed me was Steve Jobs, because when Steve Jobs brought out the iPad, it is a big toy for adults, and it did everything that to look like really serious. It had all these 3D real buttons. It looked like he came from Pixar. He had a very different interest. Everything needs to feel real, like in real life. So it was very 3D. And it was a much later move, a couple of years later, that Microsoft, of all people, started to invent flat design and develop flat design. And then now the iPad is actually, so Apple is taking flat design back from Microsoft. But this development needed to come in for me to be able to see infantilization, because the first iPad, it was not a toyish. It was very, I'm a real address book.
Wendy?
First, thank you for two really wonderful papers. I have a question for both of you. First, Finn, it really struck me when you were talking about how this is tape recorders talking to tape recorders or recording each other. It's not in a certain way. And the reason why I bring it up is because I think thinking through the difference between tape and the seriality of tape, and the difference that we have with random access actually opens up the question of temporality for you in really intriguing ways. And thinking through randomness, of course, also gets us to a different relationship to the unknowable. Because how do computer scientists deal with the unknowable? They substitute it with the random. So to think through the randomness as an intervention into that communication. And then Mercedes, I loved how you put you were arguing that media themselves put these terms at play, right? These oppositions at play. But to pick up on what's been said about the child, I wonder how you could put your talk in relation to Timon's about the security entertainment complex. Because it seems that very much the same logic is at play. And William Burroughs famously called control "mother knows best." And so it's not just a certain, the gendering is really intriguing in terms of that. I know some people like their mothers, okay, whatever. But, so I think perhaps that might give that different edge to it. And I love my mother.
So I was interested in the way, I mean, let's say, for this kind of design of this communication systems. So, I mean, first, I mean, you know, the voice became this kind of prime media to transmit these messages between whom we leave open. And then, I mean, the first thing were actually writing, I mean, things you had just had to type in some orders. And then came this imagery up, which I think, I mean, is now topped with a touch system. So, so the whole design it's coming more and more into a kind of interface with the body, I think. So it's now about like a sound image machine that you can touch. So it's like an instrument. And so I would be interested, I mean, what you say from your perspective, I mean, how far this moment of the instruments that we are, I mean, invited to play an instrument, so to say, that makes sounds, it speaks to us, you know, we can redesign it. And so is it an empowerment of the consumer to interact really with this hidden programs? Or does it entirely stay on the surface? So my question is basically, does this, I mean, let's say the discourse to, I mean, make a divide between the surface and the deep, does it make any sense? I mean, isn't it always, I mean, whatever I touch or see or do with a computer goes to the programs, I mean.
I still think I think there is sort of a big change in technical generations, and I can see it very well when I look how my mom uses the iPad, because if she still thinks she can break things. And this is how we used to use technology, you know. Technology was always something that was super fragile. In fact, yeah, no, I'm not going. And therefore I have the feeling the term of instrumentality is a term that sort of stands, that's between what we really should see. It's just in our way. You know, and it's a problem that we always say that technology is instrumental, and that's too easy. So I think it's a big problem that we do not know how to address really at the moment. But so I think the touching is a form of empowerment and changes a lot in our relation to technology. I would absolutely agree to this. And to Wendy, quickly, Timon, we need to talk. It's actually that Timon's part of, I mean, I read, and when I started to work on this, Timon wrote an essay about work which influenced me and pointed me in the direction, because I started out looking at office designs of startup companies, which are super playful, you know. If you go to Google headquarters in London, they are like, they literally have a room where you can feel like you are in your grandmother's home. So everybody is really big around you, and you sit in those big couches. And So that was what started me out to work about creativity and playfulness. So I think there is actually a very strong closeness to what Timon's take on entertainment and security, because it's.
And do you want to respond and then?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be very, very quick. I hate being the sole person who stands between us and lunch.
No, I'm also standing there.
So I will say extremely briefly. I absolutely take your point about tape, and one of the things that I and maybe this is a nice way to kind of cap off what I've been saying for this session is that one of the reasons why I wanted to call that phrase out in particular was not to be hard on Licklider or Taylor, but rather to question the way in which we frame certain kinds of exchanges as trivial or non-trivial, and that on one level there is absolutely something that seems trivial in the interaction of tape recorders, but when they're also talking about tape drives, which just as you say are like finding addresses in place and like sort of navigating between things, it begins to become somewhat more complex. And when we turn to something like extraterrestrial communication, what could be more trivial, as it were, than a short sequence of pulses that like in their time are just supposed to get across the existence of natural numbers? And yet, in theory, those are the basis for some form of deep contact between profoundly different modes of experience. So it's to say that when we talk about communication, I suspect that we need to begin rethinking not just how we evaluate how communication works or the modes in which it functions on a particular technical platform, but also how its triviality or non-triviality has to be reevaluated with reference to who is in the exchange for very wide values of who, which is maybe a way to say that the talk that I've given here, as flawed as it is much improved by having you as interlocutors for it.
So thank you for both communicating so beautifully with us on the Communicate panel.